that's fine. So Nick, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon for the session. So the title of the session is "What does the future hold for fire safety in Housing Post Grenfell?" So I think since the tragedy at Grenfell in June 2017, we have seen within the sector a number of changes that have come about from since then. So sort of the first one was the publication of the Dame Judy Hackett review in May 2018. Since then, there's also been a number of other developments, especially over the recent 12 months or so, which includes the Building a Safer Future consultation, which began in 2019, following up with the announcement of the Building Safety Regulator in January 2020. Moving on to the approval of the Fire Safety Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament. And then again, recently, the announcement from the government of an additional £1 billion of funding in relation to the remediation of unsafe cladding materials and buildings. So I think it's sort of one of those prominent things at the minute in the sector in relation to what's happening in the sector and the changes that it's going through. So as I said, I would like to thank Nick for taking the time to speak with us today. So in terms of Nick's background, Nick has been with the London Fire Brigade for over 38 years, working in a number of roles, which includes fire safety, enforcement manager, head of the fire safety policy. He's worked with local government and the chair of the Chief Fire Officers Association with their working group to produce policies and guidance on the Regulatory Reform Order 2005 and Fire and Rescue Services. Nick is currently with the NFCC, Protection Vice Chair and a Fire Service Lead on the implementation of the Hackett Review. And he's also a member of the Industry Safety Steering Group led by the Dame Judy Hackett review as well. So Nick is a founder of the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, and in 2019 he was awarded an MBE for services to fire safety. So as I said, the topic that we're going to sort of look at today and what Nick is going to take us through is, in terms of fire safety post Grenfell, what is going to be the implementation of the new regulations following that. So thank you, Nick.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. So without further ado, I'll move into the slides. So what I want to try and do is just kind of give you a little bit of history of legislation and some of the issues we've had with that to start with. So what you've got in front of you is a list of some of the major fire tragedies, and out of each one of them has come legislation. For example, if you look at the Rose and Crown, that led to the Fire Precautions Act. Bradford football ground led to the Safety at Sports Ground Act, King's Cross subsurface, and then we've now had the horrible tragedy at Grenfell back in June 2017, and you'll see that legislation is being made to do that. But I think we need to consider that, is this the right approach? All the previous ones you've got in front of you, all they ever did was fix the issues in certain building types, from either shops or offices or hotels or underground stations. And what we've not got to fall into the problem is thinking there are just problems with tower blocks. There is a fundamental issue around our construction industry and how we build things at the moment that we need to take into account, or unfortunately we'll be doing this again when there's another major fire in a care home or a nightclub or something like that. So I think that's the bit moving forward we need to take into account of how we're going to fix the system and not just fix tower blocks. So I'm going to cover where we are now. I'm going to talk a bit about the Building Safety Bill. I'm going to talk a little bit about the phase 1 recommendations, the consultation that's going on around the fire safety order uplift, and then a little bit around fire risk assessments and how they might change in the future from what they are now. So I think we mentioned this before. So when Dame Judith Hackett did her independent review, she found some real key issues that were, there's an ignorance of the regulations, there's an indifference around a lack of clarity of who's in charge. And we've definitely seen that around the leaseholders and the responsible persons that's happening at the moment. and an inadequate regulatory oversight and sufficient enforcement tools. And I think she was saying in that sense that because we hadn't had any major fire fatalities, and fire deaths and fire injuries were quite thankfully reducing, fire was seen as a hazard that had kind of done. You always going to have a few fires, and you may get an odd person who were killed in their house, but the job was done as far as government was concerned. And, you know, with the cuts and austerity to fire and rescue services, again, you know, this led to less inspecting officers and a less of a regime taking place. So I think she identified most of the causes of where we are today. I'm not always convinced that solutions were the right solutions, and we might talk about them a little bit further on. She definitely identified this race to the bottom. Everything is about price and cost, and those that are following the phase 2 Grenfell inquiry have heard some real damning evidence about how the pound note was much more important than people's safety. So where are we now? We've got a massive job of remediation. There are at least over 500 buildings that need remediating because of the external wall systems. And I think that will get more and more added to as we find more and more things with the built environment. Even where maybe the external wall system has met the requirements, then there are issues with cavity barriers, how they've been installed, etc., etc. That again means that we need to fix these buildings. The consolidated note, which brought together all the 22 notes that the government's independent expert panel under MHCLG released, has caused us to look at all buildings now rather than buildings over 18 metres. And we have the kind of fiasco with the EWS1 form, where there are, you know, mortgage lenders are asking it on things like bungalows, etc., which it wasn't to be used for. We have the wake-in watches we now have in buildings, which were only meant to be a very, very short-term kind of solution until either they were remediated or the fact that fire alarms were put in. But we now have buildings that have had wake-in watch virtually since Grenfell. You know, considerable, huge bills they're costing. You know, we're talking, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds to run a wake-in watch for a long time. And, you know, there is talk about how effective that really is in the long term. We've got the fire safety bill that just had its second reading on Monday, where they are allegedly clarifying that the external wall system was always part of the fire safety order for residential premises, confirming that front doors of flats are, but also adding things like balconies now into the mix, that, you know, they are part of the fire safety order and need to be checked. And then we've got the role of the fire risk assessments. The fire risk assessment and the fire safety order legislation is based on the assumption that a building will be built correctly. And now that assumption has kind of gone, and the fire risk assessment is turning more into a complete building review survey, and that's never what it was intended for. And most fire risk assessors haven't got that skill set to do that. They're not structural engineers, they're not facade engineers. So we have an issue with the industry about who is competent to carry out the surveys that are now required. So the building safety bill that's just going for its first trench, there's pre-legislative scrutiny that's starting next week under the Homes and Community Local Government Scrutiny Committee. And what it's trying to do is trying to create a more effective regulatory and accountable framework. You know, that will be the HSE, will be the new regulator, and they will have an oversight on all the building regulations, etc., etc. They're going to introduce clearer standards and guidance to ensure that people understand their roles and responsibilities. Residents, quite rightly, are going to be put at the heart of the new system, and there will be residents' engagement will be part of you getting a safety assurance certificate in your building, and there'll be a residents panel that will be set up, that their concerns can be heard. But also as well, there's some duty on residents. People who live in buildings, they have an obligation to make it safe. So there'll be some residents' duties as well. And hopefully this will help create the culture of change for a more responsible building industry. And this will probably be achieved by the way they're going to introduce it in kind of small fractions, starting with buildings over 18 metres. They're going to have gateways where you can't pass through one step before you go on to the next step. Currently, you can submit plans to your building control body and start building the same day before they even get approved. Then they get sent to the fire and rescue services to ensure that they meet the fire safety order. But by then it's half built and sometimes even completed. So, you can't comment because it's already done anyway. Or you get the fire and rescue service get given plans that never end up as the final built drawing anyway. There are so many changes. You may have heard in the phase 2 inquiry around the original design of the external wall system was not ACM, it was something else, but it got changed as the project moved in to try and reduce the cost of the project. So, a bit more detail about the bill. There's a new regulator, as I said, it'll be the Health and Safety Executive. They will introduce a new kind of concept. There'll be an accountable person who will have to register that building and will have to apply for a safety certificate. They will have to nominate a building safety manager. Now, the building safety manager doesn't have to be a one per building. You can have a company who provides that service, providing it for a number of buildings. So, but they'll be responsible for the day-to-day running of that block of flats, and so they'll be the person that the residents will have to deal with and ensure that their concerns are met. But the accountable person will be the one where the enforcement activity will take place on if they're not meeting the required standards. And the regulator will have the powers to remove the building safety manager if they don't think they're competent or doing a good job, and replace them with someone else. So I spoke earlier about the gateways. There'll be gateway 1 at planning stage, gateway 2 at design stage, and gateway 3 final sign off. You can't move past them gateways until you get approval at each stage, which will ensure any kind of change mechanism that goes along will be robust and challenged and also documented. And because in part of this we'll need what they call a golden thread of information, because one of the things we found post Grenfell is we don't know what's on the outside of most of our buildings. It seems strange that we don't, but we don't, and so information has to be gathered about what there is, and that's what's causing a lot of our problems at the moment. Buildings will have to be registered, so there'll be a registration of buildings. Without a registration, you can't occupy the building. And they will have this safety case regime where the accountable person will have to demonstrate to the regulator that the building is safe to occupy, and that will be around fire and structural safety. Again, we spoke a little bit about the residents. They're going to be more engaged. There will have to be an engagement strategy with them to ensure they know what's going on in their building through the life cycle. And then the final bit, there's going to be strengthening of the construction products that will be allowed to be used on buildings, which again, when we've heard about what's happened and how products are exchanged and changed during the life of a building, then this is really well called for. So from a housing point of view, if you own a tower block, there is a number of things coming your way from the outcome of phase 1. Sir Martin Moore-Bick said that basically you need to find out what's on your external wall, and you need to send that information to the fire and rescue service and make it available. And that will probably be in a premises information box where it looks like there's going to be a lot of information in this box. You need to provide evacuation plans and floor plans that are detailed enough that the fire and rescue service can use from an operational point of view, and everyone needs to be aware of your evacuation plan. So Martin Moore-Bick also asked around PEEPs, therefore every person in your building who has some kind of vulnerability or problems self-evacuating, you need to come up with an evacuation plan for them. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the fire safety order uplift. Any lifts need to be tested regularly, and any firefighting lifts need to be tested as well, and this information needs to be shared with the fire and rescue service according to Martin Morbick, but the consultation that's out at the moment slightly tweaks that. There's robust testing of fire doors, and then there's this PIB. When you look at this amount of information, this is going to have a huge cost impact on people who are housing providers, especially some of the large providers, to do this. There's also how are they going to do it. Getting access to fire doors, especially front doors, is really, really difficult. Most of them are in the leaseholder brigade. They belong to the leaseholder's flat, and therefore gaining access to that to check the fire door will be very, very difficult. And around peeps, some people won't tell you, or don't want to tell you, that they've got so many issues. They probably think it's their own business. So that is going to be a real issue of keeping that information up to date. How regularly do you have to do it? If you're a local authority with thousands of buildings, how are you going to keep this information safe and secure because of the data protection? And how are you going to ensure that it's up to date as and when it's needed by the fire and rescue service? So in the fire safety order uplift, so this is a consultation that's out as we speak, closing date's the 14th of October. It wants to make clearer who the responsible person is, and that's one of the issues we've probably got. So you've got the building safety bill that talks about an accountable person, the fire safety order that talks about a responsible person. They can be the same person, but also they could be different people, and also you could have multiple accountable persons and multiple responsible persons. So I don't think at present we've cleared one of the issues that Dame Judith found out was that there is this complex layer of accountability that needs to be clarified, and at the moment what I see in the legislation and uplift, that it's not actually achieved that. So the fire safety order is also trying to kind of mirror a bit of the building safety bill, because at the moment the building safety bill is only really going to refer to buildings over 18 metres. So what the fire safety order uplift is trying to do is bridge that gap for buildings underneath it. So it's going to make some legislation around information to residents. Currently, as the law stands at the moment, you don't have to give information about your risk assessment and stuff like that to residents, because the law talks about employees. So that's going to change, which I think is a really good idea. I think residents should have access to the issues in their building like an employee has. They're thinking of strengthening the guidance that's out there. They're going to review it, and they're thinking of making it an approved code of practice, which those of you will know, that is a quasi-legal status. At the moment, the guides are just guidance, and people can use them as they feel fit. But if it's an approved code of practice, then you have to demonstrate why you have not used that if you want to comply with the law. There's some strengthening around maintenance, Article 17 and Article 38, which talks about front doors of flats, smoke control systems and facilities for firefighters. And there's also the ability for fire and rescue services to now charge for any enforcement action that they take. So again, a real kind of improvement to the order to bring it in line with the strengthening of the building safety bill. So just that last bit on fire risk assessments. So as I said to you before, there is an assumption that buildings were built correctly, and so a fire risk assessment was more an assessment of the current risk made by the people that occupy that building and the use to its put. But now we are now discovering that buildings were not built correctly. We're trying to use the fire safety order and fire risk assessment to fix the issues. And, you know, it's not a building survey, a fire risk assessment. It was never intended for that. It was around, you know, controlling and reducing the risk for people that are there and looking at the management processes that ensure people are safe where they live and work. We are now looking like we're going to be getting some intrusive kind of surveys to kind of ensure that the building is safe structurally as well as from fire. And it was always about being reasonable and practicable. That was the bit about the fire safety order. It was not prescriptive. It was making reasonable and practical adjustments. So I'm hoping I'm going to show you a little case study very quickly about some of the issues and how difficult they are. So this is a residential block of flats built in 2006, and I won't read that to you, but the fire started, and the pictures probably are a better way. So that's an air brick, if you don't know, and there's that bark that a lot of people have, you know, outside. So if you look very carefully in the picture, that's where there's a cigarette in there, and that's how this fire started. That cigarette isn't put in there for, you know, we just went round after the fire, and you'll see the damage in a minute, and saw how this spread from outside inside as such. That's the damage it caused. You can see that's at ground floor where we started. This is the damage that's caused to the building. And there you have a nice, really, really graphic picture of how a fire can get into a cavity wall and spread up through the cavity where there are no cavity barriers or combustible bits in the cavity. The issue around this building, if you'd have checked it from a fire risk assessment before the fire, you would probably undoubtedly not be able to identify the issues because they'll all be behind the wall and you can't see them unless you do an intrusive survey. And so that's the issue you've got now, is about what do we do about fire risk assessments? Do we have to do that? Because that's not what they were intended to do. The fire caused huge extensive damage spreading through the voids and that in the building where it was not built correctly. You know, I think there was over 35 flats that had to be rehoused. And then, of course, on that same estate, there was a number of other buildings that needed this remedial work because they're all built the same. And that it was a huge cost again to put them right. Luckily, I think in this particular case, it came under the warranty, so the work was done and didn't cost anyone any money. So that was a bit of a whistle stop through because I'm sorry I was late, but I think it's now time for questions. I saw some questions on the thing, but I don't seem to be able to access them. So
I'll cover. Thank you, Nick. I think that was really useful in terms of sort of the background and where we are now. And I think it's one of those of it's going to change probably multiple times before we get to what the final solution is going to be, isn't it? So just quickly from me, and then I'll go through the other. Again, if anybody has any questions related to the presentation, there is a Q&A box at the bottom. So if you want to put your questions in, we can work through as many questions as possible. Just in relation to the accountable person, how is that, do we think, going to be managed in terms of going forward? If that is going to be an individual that's responsible for doing that sign off and providing that information, in terms of, for them, just in terms of the qualifications and things that they're going to have, and also their insurance, of having insurance in place that's actually, what do you think the risks?
I don't think there's any it's not going to be a single person. My understanding is the accountable person can be a body corporate. I think when you read the building safety bill, it talks about ownership and parts of the building that they own and have kind of responsibility for. We had quite a famous case in London in a very large tower block where unfortunately a young lady lost her life, and there was over 16 different owners of the building. Some owned things like the lift shaft and things like that. It was my understanding, and don't kind of quote me on this, it was a bit of a kind of a tax dodge. It wasn't a fire safety thing. And so if you applied that to the current building safety bill, you might have 16 accountable persons. And that to me is not clearing up who is responsible. what we need to be able to do from an enforcement point of view is we need a person, a company who we can go to, not have to argue out leases, who bit that is. It needs to be very, very clear. So we are, in our amendments to the bill, or trying to put forward that there needs to be a single accountable person, even in that kind of complex ownership. Whoever applies for the registration is the person that, for want of a better word, we can go after. I think your question about competency and that is more reflected on the building safety manager, the person who's going to be day-to-day responsible for the fire safety of that building. And there is a working group looking at the competency of a building safety manager, and they're going to produce a British standard on the competency and capabilities kind of thing of this building safety manager. So I think the worry is who would want to do that job. You know, the risk of that, it's like, you know, again, on paper is a really good idea, but the risks involved, the personal responsibility that you might have to take on taking on that role, plus dealing with residents' issues, etc., it doesn't, from where I'm sitting, look like a very attractive role. And unless you're paying big money to attract people, and that's not always getting the best people. And of course, someone's got to pay for that building safety manager who, you know, ultimately the way our leaseholder system works at the moment, it's the leaseholders that have to pay, you know. So yeah, I think there's a lot more work to do on the building safety bill, but we have got time, I suppose, to try and challenge this stuff.
Okay, brilliant. So we do have some questions if I run through the ones that have come in. So the first one is,
yeah, sure.
Sorry, so it is, the fire safety bill was passed under the Labour government on the Grenfell inquiry recommendations, been voted down on grounds of bill otherwise been slowed down, and inquiry recommendations needed to be treated separately and more thoroughly. Is this the right way to do it? And is the criticism for downvoting the amendment misplaced?
I believe that the Grenfell Phase 1 recommendations need to be put in. They've got a consultation out on them, because I think the issue is that Sir Martin Morbick quite rightly makes his recommendations, and sometimes they're not as easy to implement in reality than they would have come out in the inquiry. So I think we should try and implement them as soon as we can, but we've got to do them in a way that the people that are enforcing it, the people that are being enforced on, and those that it's going to make safe, does all them three things. I think if you rush them, you have a way of you might end up costing people a lot of money without actually making it any safer. And I think what NFCC are looking is to implement all the recommendations in a way that meets the spirit. What was Sir Martin Morbick trying to achieve? And an example will be so on the night of the fire, the firefighting lift didn't work, which slowed down the firefighters doing their role. So we need to improve that. But for building owners to send monthly reports to fire and rescue services, there are 12,000 over 18-metre buildings. Times that by 12, so you're talking about 144,000 bits of information being sent to the fire and rescue service, costing money. And if the lift is fine, why does the fire and rescue service need to know about it? What we need to know about is when the lift is not fine. So that's why the consultation talks about exception reporting, you know. So these things take time to work out. I fully appreciate it's not quick enough. It would be great if we could do it quicker, and I get that. I just think that the fire safety bill as well, because that was clarifying about external wall, they needed to do that first before they could implement the Phase 1 recommendations. But I understand why people were a bit aggrieved about it, because it does seem that these things are taking longer, but it's very, very complex area.
Yeah, no, brilliant. We've got another 5 or 6 questions we can run through.
Yeah.
Those.
Yeah, sure.
The next one was just in terms of the legislation. Is the legislation applying to Wales as well?
No, it's not actually. It's going to apply to England only because the devolved assembly, they've just produced a paper themselves. They're going down a slightly different route. My understanding is they're going to have a building safety regulator. They're going to improve the fire safety order. But it looks to me that they're going to introduce a separate piece of fire safety legislation for residential premises. So the fire safety order, I believe, will deal with workplaces, and then they're going to introduce a separate piece just for residential, which personally, in my opinion, is the right way to go. I think the fire safety order is a great piece of legislation for workplaces, has never quite worked for residential because we only have control over the common bits, and the real risk in the block of flats is in the flat itself, so I'm quite envious that the Welsh are going that way.
Brilliant, that's great. The other one, will the new bill be applied retrospectively to current buildings, and also will the changes affect houses that are converted into flats?
So when you say the bill, do you mean the fire safety bill or the building safety bill? I can talk about both if you want.
There's the new bill, so I'm not 100% sure. I'm not
right,
sure.
Okay, I'll do both. So the fire safety bill, yes, it will be retrospectively. Basically, any building that contains more than 2 residential properties. So the way I talk to people is, if you take a house that's got a flat A and B, it applies to that. Okay, and so it'll apply as soon as it comes in, because they're kind of intimating it's a clarification. In the building safety bill, all the new build stuff, obviously that's for new builds, but it will apply to over 18-metre buildings that are already built. They will still have to apply for the certificate. They will still have to have a safety case. That's the reason why they're starting in a smaller scope, because they've got 12,000 applications that the HSE have got to look through and determine whether them buildings are safe. So yes, it will apply retrospectively in both cases, basically. Houses converted to flats, definitely the fire safety bill about the external wall and that, not with the building safety bill as yet, because they're starting with only buildings over 18 metres, unless it's a house converted to flats that's over 18 metres, but that'd be a really big house.
Okay, and what is the regulatory position on the incorporation of sprinklers in apartment buildings now and going forwards?
So NFCC are fully supportive of any kind of suppression system. Sprinklers are great, but there are other systems on the market. We've campaigned long and hard to get sprinklers in, and from November, any block of flats over 11 metres will have to have sprinklers. So that's a real win. It's come down from 30 metres to 11 metres. We still think there should be mandatory sprinklers in schools, residential care homes, and we would like it in all flats eventually, but it's about cost to the build, etc. But fully agree that, sprinklers, like again in Wales, they've sprinklered everything. We just seem to be so behind sometimes.
Okay. No, brilliant. And the last question then that's come in is, so set against the Hackett review, what's your view of timber frame construction?
Okay, so again, timber frame construction is fine if built and constructed properly. There's testing done that proves that it can be just as good as traditional builds. Unfortunately, if it's not built correctly, then it will collapse quicker than traditional means. And I think what we've got at the moment is we can't trust the industry that they can build it correctly. And so therefore we are very, very wary when people start to build very, very large and tall timber frame buildings. And other methods of modern construction, not just timber. There are another, modular build and all that they pass the tests, which you need to, but it's how they're constructed on site. If you remember, we've just had a fire up in the very upper reaches of Scotland, which was a modular hotel, which was literally burnt to the ground because of the way it was constructed, and this is the issue. It's around, if they're built well as safe as anything else, but if they're not, they are more dangerous. So that's the bit. But we don't discourage them. Build it correctly, no problem at all.
Okay, no, brilliant. On that note, I just want to say thank you very much for your time. I found it really useful, and I'm sure the participants did as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry about delay at the beginning.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.